2020 has tested Oregon in unimaginable ways. A global pandemic, which has taken our dearest loved ones from us and forever changed the rituals of our daily lives. Heartbreaking loss from historic wildfires that ravaged our state and wiped entire Oregon communities off the map, deepened political divisions, and the untimely deaths of Black and Brown neighbors from across the country that inspired Oregonians to march in our streets with a clarion call for racial justice. We have been tested to the core, and the most vital needs of Oregon families, health, safety, education, housing, and the ability to earn a living have all been challenged in new ways. During these tough times, Oregonians have stepped up at every turn to protect their friends, families, and neighbors. The compassionate spirit of our state has anchored us in what it really matters, keeping each other healthy and well. Through fires, floods, and a global pandemic, we are absolutely determined to rise and rebuild. And as we do, we must ensure an equitable future for Oregon, where everyone has the opportunity to thrive and every voice is heard. This is where my budget finds its inspiration. The 2021-23 governor's recommended budget guides and defines Oregon's legislative priorities, and I consider it our state's North Star. I believe the first step to creating opportunity is in recognizing that racism is endemic to our systems, impacting every part of our culture and our economy. Every difficult turn of this past year has only proven this point, further exacerbating existing disparities for Oregon's Black, Indigenous, Latino, Latina, Latinx, Asian, Pacific Islander, Native American, and tribal communities. We've seen this firsthand through the pandemic's impacts to the Warm Springs tribe and to Pacific Islanders in Union County. We've seen it with undocumented families who lost their homes to wildfires. I will fight so that all of these same communities are not left behind again. This year, I convened the Racial Justice Council to have regular and ongoing conversations with Oregon's communities of color. One of the visions of the Racial Justice Council is to dismantle structural racism in Oregon state government, and by doing so, have resounding impacts on communities across our state. Working with the council on my budget, we committed to centering and uplifting the voices of these communities, because brick by brick, through new policies and new practices backed by real investment, we can make meaningful change. While our state's and our nation's long history of racist policies will not be deconstructed in one budget cycle, I am so very proud we have prioritized racial equity and sought to close opportunity gaps so that in the future, race will no longer predict outcomes. Because actions matter, across my budget, I found ways to make over $280 million in investments prioritized by the Racial Justice Council. This budget delivers on decisive investments to begin the process of recognizing and undoing systemic racism in Oregon, including more than $10 billion to help ensure every student has access to a well-rounded education and wraparound services such as nutrition support. This includes increased access to quality, affordable early childhood education for 8,000 more kids, and investments in Oregon schools, prioritizing career and technical education and building anti-racist curriculums for every school across the state. Investments in behavioral health, informed by my Behavioral Health Advisory Council, including nearly $30 million to diversify behavioral health and medical workforces so that they better reflect the communities they serve. Reforms to our criminal justice system to center racial equity and de-emphasize mass incarceration. $118 million to invest in broadband expansion statewide, with a focus on providing access to communities that have been disproportionately impacted during the pandemic and ensuring every single school across Oregon is connected to the internet. More than $20 million to help provide a pathway to home ownership for Black, Indigenous, Latino, Latina, Latinx, Asian, Pacific Islander, Native, and tribal community, as well as adding co-op and land trust models to our system. This builds upon a $65 million increased investment over the last biennium and is part of a larger than $250 million housing package to help ensure that all Oregonians have a warm, safe, dry, affordable, and accessible place to call home. Roughly $7 million to reduce Oregon's carbon emissions and build green energy practices so that our communities of color and tribal communities can access clean air and water. And nearly $190 million dedicated to helping rebuild communities impacted by the wildfires. This includes recovery efforts such as debris cleanup, housing, and food assistance, but it also includes investments to help communities build back better so that they can prepare for future wildfire seasons. These are just a few highlights. We must take the lessons learned from the last recession, from this pandemic, and from the wildfires, and ensure that this time, no one is left behind. Our budgets, policy agenda, and priorities reflect, support, and honor the communities who bore the brunt of the devastation this past year. I know Oregon will recover from these turbulent times, but we can't do any of this alone. The pandemic has led to a state budget shortfall that will require not only scrapping plans for long-needed investments, but also making small and difficult cuts in services and programs that affect Oregonians' lives. And while state government is maximizing the value of every taxpayer dollar, we need help. Let me be very, very clear. This budget doesn't put enough money into our schools. It doesn't make the investments in public health we need. It's a budget built on sacrifice and hard choices. And while our state can deliver the core services that Oregonians expect us to, it doesn't go far enough to heal the pain of 2020, because Oregon alone can't do that. We need the federal government to stand up and respond to this moment of crisis. My budget lays out a roadmap. Ending COVID-19 is the first step to recovery. We must have additional funding for COVID-19 testing and health services and support for the Oregon Health Plan. Fighting COVID-19 over the next year will cost us at least another $685 million. We need federal help to help keep this fight up and Medicaid funding to make sure that Oregonians who've lost their jobs don't lose their health care as well. After COVID-19, the next priority is making sure the pandemic doesn't lead to a wave of homelessness. Across the state, it's estimated that landlords and renters need $350 million in relief to make up for losses and arrears during COVID-19. Targeted support for homeowners who will struggle with future mortgage payments because of the crisis should also be included in this federal package. Oregonians laid off during the COVID-19 winter need another round of expanded unemployment insurance. And our businesses, which have sacrificed so much during the pandemic, are in need of another round of the Paycheck Protection Program to keep them afloat. Also, Oregon has lost half of its childcare supply, and providers are struggling to remain open and compliant with COVID-19 requirements. Families are unable to afford childcare. Rebuilding has to start now. We need federal aid for childcare, for our schools, for universities and community colleges that are working to reopen amid increasing challenges posed by COVID-19. Our cities, counties, tribal governments, and court systems need help overcoming the impacts of COVID-19 on their budgets. And every single Oregonian impacted by the Labor Day fires needs a federal government willing to help them rebuild their communities. I think it's clear that the events of this year will forever change what 2020 hindsight means. But we cannot be stuck looking backward. Oregon's shown through our recent election, our vote by mail system was a model for the nation as a safe, accessible, and secure way to ensure that everyone's voice is heard. I hope that as the era of political dysfunction comes to an end in Washington, D.C., Oregonians from all backgrounds are ready to rebuild our state. Together, we can build a better Oregon for everyone. Thank you. Charles, now ready to take questions.
Thanks, Governor. Just a quick reminder for the reporters on the line, please use the raise your hand function to get into the question queue. We'll start with Tim Gordon from KGW. Go ahead, Tim.
Wow, I get to be first. Good afternoon, Governor.
Good afternoon.
Very good.
I can hear you just fine.
Great. I just have to ask, I mean, there's a lot of ask of the federal government here, and what are your expectations on what we'll actually get and what happens if we don't get the money that you're asking?
Look, what I think is really important is that Republicans and Democrats in Washington, D.C. put aside their political differences and put the American people first. And that means working together and solving problems. And I will just tell you that through the National Governors Association, I hear from governors from red states and governors from blue states and Republican governors that represent blue states and the other way around. And we can't agree on much, but we can all agree that we need a substantial federal package. And it needs to include investments for our pandemic response. It needs to include investments in our children. Our children need COVID relief. Our schools need help. And our businesses and our struggling families need help as well. So I'm going to do everything in my power. I've spent the last several days talking to community groups from all over the state of Oregon, encouraging them to add their voices to this call for a federal package. And I'm going to work with my colleagues across the country to ensure that we can make this happen. Honestly, it is time for Washington, D.C. to get its act together. Unlike the federal government, state governments have to balance our budget. We have to meet the needs of the pandemic. Our revenues are down as a result of the recession caused by the pandemic, and yet we've got to meet the needs of vulnerable Oregon families. And frankly, we have got to invest and rebuild in our communities.
Thanks, Tim. We'll go next to Wayne Haverly with COIN. Go ahead, Wayne.
Yeah, thank you, Governor. Yesterday, an OSHA administrator told us that they don't have the staffing or the capacity to do more inspections, and that out of the top 30 workplace outbreaks in Oregon, they only were able to inspect 2 of those. Are you aware of this, and is the state doing anything about this problem?
I'm absolutely aware that many of our state agencies are overwhelmed with the pandemic response, and OSHA being one of them. It's certainly a top priority for me to make sure that our workers are safe in our workplaces. And I'm working with my team and with legislative leadership to make sure that agencies like OSHA have the resources and the staffing they need to meet the response.
Thanks, Wayne. We'll go next to Hillary Baroud with the Oregonian. Go ahead, Hillary.
Hi, Governor. I'm wondering if you can speak more to where the shortfall is in this budget, since it is about an 8% increase from the 1921 legislatively approved budget. And we're seeing that the school's budget is pretty close to CSL, and you have some big increases that I'm also wondering about more, such as in economic development and community development programs. It's looking like that's up 50% or 56% from the legislatively approved budget. Thanks.
Thanks. Well, my top priority was making sure that core services that Oregonians depend on, particularly during a global pandemic and the historic wildfires, that they remained in place. 2 examples of that include, of course, our work to ensure that the 150,000 Oregonians that were added to the Oregon Health Plan have access to health care and other services, whether it's providing for our vulnerable children in foster care or making sure that families have the ability to put food on the table through the SNAP program were held in place. In terms of where did we see the pain, I will tell you, we saw it in places in the budget, from our court system to our public safety system. Together, our public safety system, we cut roughly $100 million. I had a very tough conversation with the hospitals today because the Oregon Health Plan is still short roughly $400 million, so that we need to work collaboratively to preserve our healthcare infrastructure. We need to make sure that our hospitals and medical providers have the tools they need to provide healthcare for Oregonians around the state.
Thanks, Hillary. We'll go next to Gary Warner with EO Media. Go ahead, Gary. Gary, I think you might still be on mute. Okay, we'll come back to Gary. We'll go next to Wright Gazaway with K2. Go ahead, Wright.
Real quick follow on what you just said. The Hospital Association just sent out a statement after you started, saying that the cuts to the hospitals could force them to reduce services to Oregonians during a pandemic. Can you just respond to that direct criticism?
Absolutely. I'm absolutely committed to making sure that every Oregonian, regardless of who they are or where they live, has access to health care. If the pandemic has shown us nothing else, it's that healthcare is so critically important for every Oregonian. As I met with the hospitals this morning, I said this is the starting point, and I look forward to working with them to make sure that we have the resources to provide healthcare to every Oregonian, and that we can sustain the Oregon Health Plan into the future. In addition, frankly, to providing very critical healthcare to Oregonians, our hospitals and our medical providers also provide really good paying jobs. And I want to make sure that we don't lose that healthcare infrastructure in communities around the state. And I'm absolutely committed to working with them to make sure that we can create a sustainable future.
Thank you. Just one quick follow-up. You mentioned in your budget that you needed some federal help on the testing stuff. The White House reports have consistently said that we need to increase testing for asymptomatic and other exposed people. What would an ideal testing project look like in Oregon, and why is that something the state cannot fund?
So our needs for the next year for the pandemic response run roughly $750 million. I think I said in my remarks, $685 million. This includes testing, it includes contact tracing, and it includes vaccinations. Ideally, every Oregonian who wants a COVID test should be able to get one. Obviously, we are a ways off from ensuring that that system exists. But in order to deliver, we need financial help from the federal government. And this is an area where Republicans and Democrats and everyone in between can help us with that. Everyone has the ability to call their congressperson, their congressman, or their congresswoman. We can all write letters, we can all send emails. Together, if we work collectively, I'm confident that our federal government will step up and provide assistance to help us.
Thanks, Wright. It looks like we have Gary Warner back with EO Media. Go ahead, Gary.
Thanks. Governor, before the pandemic, higher education funding was already hurting. What's your budget going to do to higher education funding, both on community colleges and on four-year universities? And if you could help me find a little grain of sand in there, is there going to be money for OSU Cascades and their capital budget?
In the capital budget, yes, there is money for OSU Cascades. What I have heard from the community is that the student center is really important. In my visits to the university, I heard from students who said, honestly, I wouldn't be able to attend higher education without the presence of this campus in Central Oregon. So I know it's a life changer for many Oregon students. So I look forward to working with the legislature to fund this particular project. In terms of higher education, I will tell you that I struggled making really difficult choices and tough decisions. I didn't have enough resources to build the budget I wanted, particularly for higher education. Both the universities and the community colleges were left at the legislatively approved budget from the last biennium. So I am hoping that we can work with the legislature to find some more resources for our universities and our community colleges. Our community colleges are workhorses. They are the ones providing career and technical education. They are working hard to make sure that students in communities very small and even very large have access to the skills they need to provide for their families. And our universities literally open up the world for our students. We need to make sure these are both adequately funded.
Thank you, Governor.
Thanks, Gary. We'll go next to Dirk Vanderhart with OPB. Oh, go ahead, Dirk.
Okay, thanks. A couple quick questions, Governor. You mentioned potential new resources for higher ed. Are you planning to push another revenue stream in the upcoming session? Do you have one in mind? I didn't see it in your proposal. Or alternatively, are you committed to not pushing for a new tax or something along those lines? And second of all, sorry, I also didn't see a lot of mention of your executive order around capping greenhouse gas emissions and doing that via your administration. Is that effort fully funded in this budget, or are you leaving some components of that behind?
In answer to your last question first, I am committed to fully funding the work we are doing through my executive order to cap greenhouse gas emissions in Oregon. You might recall either the first or the second special session, we worked to make sure that we had adequate funding for the agency to continue this critically important work to tackle global climate change. As we saw with the wildfires this year, climate change is impacting Oregon now, and we need to take action now, and I'm absolutely committed to following through. In terms of revenue, given the challenge with the budget, this budget plans a couple of things. As I mentioned earlier, cuts in systems, whether it was public safety, healthcare, and others. We also, frankly, closed some tax loopholes that primarily benefit wealthy Oregonians. So that's how we approach the budget, and frankly, asking for a lifeline from the federal government.
So no new taxes then, but you are closing some tax loopholes, which a lot of people might consider a tax raise.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dirk. We'll go next to Sarah Hurwitz with KPTV. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thank you, Governor. You know, last month there's been a push from some Oregon lawmakers for a legislative special session to help some struggling Oregonians right now. What's the likelihood that you would declare a catastrophic disaster so that the legislature can actually conduct a remote session?
I think that the likelihood of a catastrophic session is great. I am absolutely committed to making sure that we meet the needs of vulnerable Oregonians, particularly those who may be evicted from their rental homes at the end of the year. I am working with legislative leadership on that package. In terms of how we do it, honestly, given the level of community virus spread, I think we have to do it in such a way that it is safe for legislators, for the staff, and ensure a way for Oregonians to participate via technology and public hearings.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. We'll go next to Peter Wong with the Portland Tribune. Go ahead, Peter.
Governor, okay.
There you go.
Okay. On the Oregon Health Plan and FMAP, would a continued increase in the federal share of Medicaid eliminate that shortfall, or do you have to negotiate something like a new provider tax agreement or some other way to raise the revenue, given that you would not want to cut services?
Thanks, Peter. And I would love to ask you a question when I'm done answering yours. As I mentioned earlier, I think it's so critically important during a global pandemic that every Oregonian have access to healthcare. We've done really good work. Right now, we have roughly 94% of Oregonians covered, adult Oregonians covered through the Oregon Health Plan, and 100% of our children are eligible for the Oregon Health Plan. I think Oregon can do better, and we should be at 100% for adults. I think we've seen the impacts of this pandemic, particularly on our historically underserved communities of color and tribal communities. So as I mentioned, we have a shortfall in meeting the needs, the funding needs of the Oregon Health Plan, roughly $400 million. I'm really open to that conversation and how we do that. I do think one of the challenges in putting together this budget is that I didn't know what level of federal aid, including FMAP match, that we would be receiving. And our revenue forecast will be updated in February. The legislature will have the benefit of both of these, I hope, and it will enable them to build the budget on more concrete revenue. In the meantime, I've already tasked my team, led by Tina Edlin, to sit down with hospitals, providers, and labor advocates to have conversations about how we can close this gap. I think the challenge for our healthcare system is that everybody is just spread really, really thin. Folks have been working so hard for the last 10 months to meet the healthcare needs during this pandemic. As you know, we're in the midst of a surge. A number of our hospitals, particularly in the metro area, have already modified elective or non-emergent surgeries to ensure that they have enough beds and ICU beds for this COVID surge. So it's really a challenging time for our healthcare system. And I'm hoping over the next few months, we can come together and come up with a package that will sustain funding for the Oregon Health Plan and deliver our priorities of making sure that every Oregonian has access. And so, Peter, my question for you is, how long have you been working in the Capitol or reporting in the Capitol?
If you subtract the 5 years from 2015 to the start of the pandemic when I was reassigned back here, 35 years. Actually, my first special session was in August 1980, so 40 years.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Peter. We'll go next to Julia Silverman with Portland Monthly. Go ahead, Julia.
Am I unmuted? There we go.
Yes,
Governor,
we can hear you.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Governor, as you know, a number of your colleagues in other states, including New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Washington, have taken some very specific steps toward reopening schools, including a statewide program providing testing for educators and students, centralized bulk purchasing for air quality improvements like air purifiers, and school-specific contact tracing. I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit why Oregon hasn't yet adopted any of those measures, particularly given the data emerging from around the country and the world that schools, and in particular elementary schools, don't seem to be centers of transmission, as we most recently heard yesterday on OPB from Dr. Dawn Nolt, the medical director for infection prevention at OHSU Dornbecker. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. And I was just on a call with superintendents this morning and on a call with teachers and advocates yesterday. I am absolutely committed to getting our kids back into schools. We know that our kids are literally suffering from COVID in so many ways, a COVID crisis, so to speak. They are frankly struggling with a lack of social and emotional support that they get in our schools. They are struggling with online learning, and they are struggling, frankly, with some basic services. The school districts have worked really hard. The teachers have worked incredibly hard to do the best they can with comprehensive distance learning. We know that some school districts in Oregon have been successful in reopening, particularly in our rural school districts. Other school districts, frankly, have challenged when the community spread is high. And that's what we're seeing, frankly, all across Oregon. So there are a number of strategies that we are working on, including addressing vaccination needs for teachers and professionals that are in the school system, addressing other tools that our schools need to reopen, and working with our teachers, with our superintendents to figure out how we can do this safely for professional staff, for teachers, and for our kids.
Sorry, so if I could just quickly follow up, are you saying that there is a plan then for school-specific contact tracing and testing, or something in the work?
We are working on a plan specific for vaccinations for teachers and schools.
Thanks, Julia. We have time for just a few more questions, so we'll go next to Ben Botkin with the Lund Report. Go ahead, Ben.
Yes, Governor. I was hoping you could clarify one thing. I heard you mention a $400 million shortfall in the context of healthcare, I believe. And the press materials I've read mention a 718 million shortfall. So I was just hoping you could clarify that.
Ben, I will have my public health advisor get back to you for the details on that.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ben. We have time for just 2 more questions, so we'll go next to Noelle Crombie with the Oregonian. Go ahead, Noelle.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Noelle.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Governor. Good afternoon. Governor, I was wondering if you could address your proposal to close 3 minimum security prisons, given the pushback we heard from Lakeview and North Bend over the summer, and how that proposal fits into your criminal justice priorities.
Thank you. Oregon has made some incredibly great strides toward criminal justice reform. Under the prior administration, Governor Kitzhaber, we took the steps to create the criminal justice reinvestment plan that has been extremely successful. In the last legislative session, we passed Senate Bill 1008, really incredible reforms. And there is so much more work that we need to do. And I am working closely with my Racial Justice Council to ensure that we are centering the voices of Black, Brown, and tribal Oregonians in that work. My plan for the future of our prison system is that the state will no longer invest in extensive and expensive buildings, but invest in the people. Rehabilitation, and of course, ensuring that our communities can be safe upon their release. The schedule is over a period of time. So I am proposing that Mill Creek close the first of next year, January 2021. I'm sorry, I got that wrong, July of 2021, my staff is all panicking. Shutter Creek in Coos Bay closed 6 months later, and then Warner Creek in Lakeview closed a year and a half later, essentially. So it's 6 months, 6 months, and 6 months starting July 1st of 2021. Got those dates right. And the reason for this is that obviously Mill Creek is in Salem. There are other correctional facilities that can absorb the corrections officers here and take on these really great employees that have been on the front lines of the COVID pandemic. In Coos Bay, that is roughly a year out. We will be working with those corrections officers to work on reemployment either in state system or elsewhere, and obviously Lakeview as well. These are really tough decisions. And I have to say to our corrections officers around the state, I know it's been an extremely challenging year. We are grateful to you for your hard work. We appreciate everything that you are doing to protect our adults in custody, and look forward to working with you as we make this transition to a more just Oregon.
Thanks, Noelle. We have time for just 1 more question, so we're going to go to Dick Hughes. Go ahead, Dick.
Thank you very much. Governor, to follow up on that question, as I often like to do, I want to ask about rural Oregon. Prisons are centers of employment in rural towns. I mean, like, that's why Sheridan wanted a federal prison. And when you're talking about equity, people in rural Oregon would say, where's the equity for us? And we're losing these sources of jobs and vendors and things like that. So how does your budget treat rural Oregon, and how will it help Coos Bay and Lakeview and places like that survive this loss of jobs?
So Dick, I will I will end the conversation today with where I began it, and that is around racial justice. What the pandemic taught us is that we have communities of color in every single corner of the state, and that it's critically important that we invest in all of these communities, provide them with the tools and the resources, not only to survive, but to thrive. And I think it's fair to say that our communities of color, our tribal communities, also primarily in rural Oregon, and our rural communities have been historically underserved. We make significant investments in these budgets to address these needs. I also made significant investments in our communities that were impacted by the wildfires. Not only did we provide specific relief for repair and rebuild, but we added additional resources, including $170 million for community development, and then an additional $70 million for wildfire preparedness. This looks like job creation. It looks like harvest and thinning and prescriptive burning so that we can build healthier, more fire-resistant landscapes. I invested over $100 million in broadband. Every single school across the entire state must and deserves to be connected to the internet. That benefits both rural and urban Oregon, of course. And then we have the ability to create, to invest in communities through capital construction. For example, in each one of the fire impacted communities that was on the list for a courthouse, I funded those projects. We funded other projects. And I think, Dick, you know, I've been trying to rebuild the dam in Wallowa County for a couple of years now. And all of the projects, almost all of the projects that were on the 1921 lottery list were refunded again this year, including the Wallowa Lake Dam.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dick. That's all the time we have for questions today, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Charles.
Thanks, Governor.
Thank you.